Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. It is always a pleasure to welcome back to the program Ari Berman. Is the national voting rights correspondent from Mother Jones Magazine, author of 2 books, if I'm not mistaken. The most recent three. Apologies.
You always miss one of my books.
There's always one I miss. But the most recent, Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it. Your first one was actually a campaign book, right?
Herding donkeys. Yeah, I just don't like it that much. So I just don't.
That's why I don't talk about it either. I sense that. Yeah. Ari, great to see you. I've talked a little bit about these stories peripherally, and it's hard to know how much impact they're going to have. But the context in which we're discussing these things are that Donald Trump won the 2016 election with 70,000 votes over the course of 3 states. I think Biden won with a margin of even less than that over the course of like 4 states. So when we're talking about 5,000 votes, 10,000 votes, 15, 20,000 votes, that's a big deal, even though we're talking about states with millions of votes. And so any tiny change to the voting processes can really have a big impact. And you've obviously been writing about this. When you, if you were to put like a little siren on top, which state right now would get that siren?
Well, I've been doing a lot of sirens on Georgia recently because that is the state where the Trump campaign seems the most dead set on trying to rig the election ahead of time. They're basically rerunning the 2020 playbook, but now they're doing it before the election. And I think the state where they're doing it the most clearly is Georgia, because they are changing how elections are run and potentially how elections are certified there through the state election board, which now has 3 Trump MAGA election denier appointees as a controlling majority. And so they are passing the greatest number of rule changes that could lead to disputes over how votes are counted, that could lead to election officials not certifying the results. And they're also doing it at the 11th hour when it could cause the greatest amount of impact and confusion.
And I mean, Georgia seems like almost like the least likely because of the hostility between Kemp and Trump and was it
Raffensperger?
Raffensperger. Yeah. I mean, you know, Georgia's the place where they recorded Trump saying, like, I just need a couple of more votes. But this board is independent. So what is the what are Georgia state officials doing in terms of like this board, and what is the board specifically doing?
So Georgia, that's true. The Republicans in Georgia did stand up to Trump, but Georgia is still the only major swing state in which Republicans control all levels of government.
So that's why this is happening. It's not so much that Georgia's strategic as much as this is the place we can do it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Georgia was the only place where they could take over the election board in this kind of way. So what happened was they purged the Republicans that stood up to Trump from the election board. Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, who resisted Trump's demand to find 11,780 votes to reverse Biden's victory, he was kicked off the election board by Republicans. They changed the composition of the board. They gave the legislature and the Georgia Republican Party the power to appoint a majority of the board. They appointed election deniers to that board. Trump famously campaigned in Georgia and Atlanta and praised these election board members who no one had ever heard of before then as pit bulls fighting for, I think he said, honesty, transparency, and victory. And then the board started passing all of these rule changes. And what the board can do is they can give guidance to counties in terms of what the law says. So they said that counties must undertake what it called a reasonable inquiry before certifying the election without specifying what a reasonable inquiry meant. They said that counties were entitled to all election-related documentation, which is a very broad list of documents. They most recently said that they need to hand count ballots on election day. All of this could be used as a pretext for Republican county officials not to certify an election if a Democrat wins.
My understanding too, I mean, on top of all this, the hand count, like Well, like, what is the sort of subtextual strategy here? Because there seems to be like an idea, and, I think always about the Republicans in Pennsylvania who said, like, you can't count early ballots until the end of the election on election day, which makes no sense unless the idea is we want these elections to sort of like we want the results to be delayed. Like, what is the
Exactly.
value? What is the sort of strategic subtextual value to Republicans to delay the counting of the votes, essentially?
Well, so they can weaponize it to their favor, because as you mentioned, in 2020, all of the state legislatures had the power to authorize the counting of mail ballots in a quicker kind of way. They refused to do so. And then, of course, it took longer to count those ballots. And then Trump weaponized that delay. And that was the beginning of his let's overturn the election argument, was that these states flipped in some kind of way because it took longer to count mail ballots, and his lead disappeared, basically. And that was the beginning of his campaign to try to steal the election. So what's going to happen in Georgia?
And we should just say, like, the lead doesn't disappear. It's just that there's only a certain number of ballots that have been counted.
Well, exactly.
Like, there's real lead once everybody's voted.
But the thing is everyone in the media explained this ahead of time, and everyone knew what was going to happen. And then when it happened, Trump pointed to it as Exhibit A for the conspiracy that Democrats were rigging votes in Atlanta or in Milwaukee or in Phoenix or wherever it took longer to count ballots. So what's going to happen in Georgia is, because they now have to hand count the ballots, and the interesting thing is they're not actually hand counting votes. They're just comparing basically the machine vote count to a hand vote count, but that's going to take longer. And so what's happened is the results in Georgia are going to take longer. If there's some kind of delay, Trump's going to try to weaponize it. Then if counties don't certify the election, that could lead to a longer delay. What's likely going to happen is that some counties are going to refuse to certify. They have to certify by the Monday after the election day, so basically 6 days after. There's going to be some period of time in which they don't certify, and then likely what's going to happen is Republican officials, like the Secretary of State, are going to take them to court. The courts are going to say they have to certify, because that's what happened in other states. But if that period of time when they don't certify, which could be a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, that's going to leave a tremendous amount of space for Trump to spread disinformation about the vote counting process if that happens.
And we should say, like, I mean, I know you remember the 2000 election. I mean, so much of, we think it's like the vote is what the vote is. But even in the Supreme Court ruling, Bush v. Gore, they were hyper conscious of the perception of who won. In fact, they ruled that it would be prejudicial to George Bush if it appeared that he hadn't won in some fashion, which of course he hadn't won yet. There was no winner to the election. But like, this concept is out there, and it makes a big difference in the way that elections go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the fact that, well, first the media called Florida for Bush, so it felt like, and then it shifted, but it felt like the whole time the presumption was that Bush had won the state, even though there was never a period of time in which all votes are counted. And that remains a common misperception in Florida. What the Supreme Court did is the U.S. Supreme Court stopped the Florida Supreme Court from ordering a full recount of ballots. So there was never a full recount of ballots that eventually, I think, would have showed Al Gore won the state of Florida, but it never got to that. And so that really is my concern here, is that everyone thinks that we won't relive 2020 again. And hopefully we don't relive 2020 again. But Trump was trying to overturn the votes in a number of states, at least 3 states he was trying to overturn the results in. And he had to overturn 45,000 votes after the votes were counted. What if it's only 1 state? What if the votes aren't fully counted because counties refuse to certify? That's a different kind of situation. Then it might become more like Bush v. Gore in 2000 than Trump trying to throw out tens of thousands or potentially millions of votes in 2020.
And I know everybody's contemplating, like, what is this going to do to the Majority Report live show election coverage? But that's, we should say, is secondary. If we leave there and we don't have a winner, that's just the case. I mean, we have to deal with it. But is there a room, or are there people, I should say, who are sitting around? Maybe they're getting in contact with Steve Bannon sitting in a prison somewhere. But are they saying, like, okay, we have the ability to stall in Georgia. We've got some things going on in North Carolina. We might be able to mess with Wisconsin. We'll talk about these specifically. And so here's the plan. We're going to try and get one of these states to drag it out for a week, and then we're going to do X, Y, Z. Like they've got a plan, right? I mean, it may or may not, it may be sort of bananas, or maybe not, but they've got a plan, right? I mean, this isn't willy-nilly.
Exactly. And I think Georgia is the most concrete evidence we've seen yet of that plan, because what you have in Georgia is you have the national Trump officials, the people who tried to subvert the 2020 election, working with the state officials. So you see people who were, for example, Trump's lawyers in 2020, Cleta Mitchell, the Republican activist that was on the call with Brad Raffensperger, where Trump said that he wanted to reverse Biden's victory. I mean, she's been working with these local county board of elections. I mean, they're not getting this from nowhere. They're putting rule change after rule change after rule change through this board. And clearly someone is advising these county election officials, because the three members of the board themselves, they have no election related experience. They haven't worked on county election boards. They're people who came through basically the Stop the Steal movement in 2020. So they're getting their information from somewhere, and it's being fed by national conservative organizations, groups with ties to Project 2025, all of that. Georgia's not going to be the only state they focus on, but it's where they have the greatest amount of power. Now, they're certainly going to try to rerun that playbook in other swing states. The question is, are there other officials that could do something about it in the other swing states? For example, in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, there's Democratic majorities on the state Supreme Court there. So it would seem hard to pull it off there. There's Democratic secretaries of state or Democratic legislatures. Remember, in 2020, Trump tried to drag the leaders of the Michigan and Pennsylvania legislatures to the White House to overturn the results. Well, Democrats now control the Michigan legislature, and Pennsylvania is split. So in some ways, they have less of an ability to do this, but they're also a lot more organized and sophisticated, because in 2020, I'm sure you remember this, Sam, it was the Four Seasons Total Landscaping, Rudy Giuliani hair dye down the face type of election stealing. Now they control election boards in states like Georgia. So they can do this through more the quote unquote normal channels, and they can set it up before the election, which they think will be more effective.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.